It is now. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the first annual Truth and Consequences Political Zoomcast. And I am thrilled today to be joined by my old friend, Jeremy Rosner, who is a political pollster, former speechwriter, and one of the smartest observers of American politics that I know. Jeremy and I talk pretty frequently. He helps with a lot of my ideas for columns, and I just consider him a good friend and a good and smart person to talk about politics with. So I thought he'd be the best person to begin these Zoomcasts with. So Jeremy, thank you for being here with us today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So let's get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about, so you are a political pollster. That's sort of your experience and sort of your involvement in politics. So tell me what you think right now. How is Joe Biden doing? What do the polls say about Biden and his people's views of him, American public's views of him?
Yeah, I think Joe Biden's doing pretty well, better than a lot of people expect. The 51% of the vote, but his approval ratings are up in the, depending which average you look at, 53, 54, 55% range. Some of the polls even show him in the high 50s. You contrast that with Donald Trump, who got elected with 46% in 2016, and his numbers just went south from there. He sunk to the low 40s, ended in, perhaps around 40s, now in the high 30s. So that the fact that Biden's numbers have gone up is good. That doesn't always happen. Obama sort of steadily went down after he got elected. And Biden's numbers are sort of on a par with where George W. Bush and Obama were at this point. We're a week away from 100 days into Joe Biden's presidency, and it's not bad, especially in an era of such intense partisan division. I mean, presidents just really don't get honeymoons anymore. They're lucky if they get a nice motel room on their wedding night. And so, to be up at 53, 54, 55% is pretty good. He's already passed a whopping big piece of legislation in the American Rescue Plan. He's got another one on the table that is getting pretty good reviews, although he's obviously got a very tough fight in Congress. He's next week, he'll unveil his third big package with sort of human services programs. He's caught, I think, some lucky breaks and shown some skill. He's exceeded his targets for getting vaccines into people's arms, including mine, and is getting very high marks from the public, up near 70% approval ratings on his handling of COVID and vaccines. And I think the fact that there was a guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, which 70% of Americans agree with, and over 50% of Republicans, with no violence or civil unrest after that, I think creates a nice contrast for Biden with the period under Trump when George Floyd was killed and unrest erupted everywhere. So I think Biden can argue that he's turned the corner on COVID, that the economy is starting to recover, and the numbers on the economy, are already pretty amazing and could be even more amazing. The Conference Board is predicting 5% GDP growth for the year, but Goldman Sachs this week came out and said it might be 8%.
Wow.
We haven't seen 8% in our lifetime.
That's amazing.
In 1984, it was 7%, biggest year of my adult life. And that was the year that, Reagan won 49 out of 50 states over poor, just departed Walter Mondale. But right. 8%, we've never seen out of anything like that. So, I mean, the economy, COVID's turning the corner, the economy's turning the corner. Racial justice seems to be moving in baby steps in a good direction. Legislation is kind of moving a little bit. So I think he's had a good start. I think one of the odd things about him is, the folks I talked to in politics, I was talking with a political operative yesterday who was saying, in our discussions, we talk about all this stuff, COVID and the economy and immigration and Russia, sanctions, China. He said, oddly, the name Joe Biden just doesn't come up much.
It's interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, approval ratings just don't quite capture how much people are talking about the guy. Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he was in your face every morning. Right. You'd wake up to a tweet storm. Joe Biden has taken a very unusual path in the modern presidency of being pretty low key. And it seems to be working for him right now on most issues, maybe not on immigration, but on most issues, I think it's working. But it means that the issues are in the spotlight more than the president.
So can I make an observation? Something you said a second ago about George Floyd. I remember pretty distinctly that Trump's approval numbers really fell after those protests, after George Floyd's murder. And I hadn't thought about that, but I do wonder whether or not the guilty verdict and the fact that there wasn't any kind of a recreation of what happened last summer, that may have actually helped a little bit, may have said to people, well, things are a lot calmer with this guy than they were with Trump. But I want to just also jump to one thing you said a second ago about, considering where the economy is headed and where the vaccines are, you might expect Biden's numbers to be a little bit higher than in the low to mid 50s. Are we just at a point now where presidents just cannot get 60, 70% approval ratings because the country is just too polarized for that to happen?
Yes. In the absence of something like a 9/11, which, boosted George W. Bush's approval ratings up to about 90%. In the absence of something like that, polarization makes it awfully hard to get those kind of numbers. But the other thing I would stress, though, is there's always a lag between a president's approval numbers behind the economy. And it's a big lag. And you saw it with Clinton when he, presided over an economic rebound. And you've seen it with others. And it's easily a year. You see this internationally as well. Sort of economic gloom is downwardly sticky, which is it's very easy for people to lose confidence in their economic situation. And when things get better, it takes a while. And you think about the people who grew up in the Great Depression, they're still recovering from that,
Right, sure.
And so there's a downward, there's a stickiness about economic gloom. And so it's not just partisan polarization, although that's a lot of it. I think it's going to take a while. But, if Goldman Sachs turns out to be right, and we have a year of anything near 8% GDP growth, and let's keep in mind, Trump said, I'm going to get GDP growth up to 5%.
Right.
He never got close. He was like in the mid twos.
Right.
8% would feel like we all have Bitcoins coming out of our ears. We've never lived through, in recent memory, we've never lived through anything like that. If we had a full year of that, I think you would see, who knows, other calamities could happen, knock on wood, they won't, COVID, whatever. But if the economy was growing at 8% GDP growth and we didn't have other big calamities on COVID or other issues, I think you would start to see Biden have some, unusually high. I don't know if it would break 60, but
this gets to a question you and I have debated frequently, because I sort of the view that, if you look at the economic numbers during Trump's presidency and his approval, there was this 20-point gap between people's views of the economy, people's views of Trump. And it wasn't just for Trump. You saw this in the tail end of the Obama years too, when people's views of the economy were pretty positive, but it didn't translate into better approval ratings for Obama. And I guess the question is, we've always assumed that it's the economy, stupid, right? That as the economy goes, the president's approval goes up or down with it. If the economy improves, it goes up. If it goes down, his approval rating goes down. Are we past that point? Have we reached a point now where the economy is no longer as determinative as it once was in American politics?
Yes. So the economy is no longer as determinative as it once was, for a couple of big reasons, and they're related. One is, as you said, partisan polarization. People are tribal. They're either on the red team or the blue team, and everything else is irrelevant. And the second thing, which is closely related to that, is partly as a result, we are in, we've increasingly moved into a period of post-substance politics, that issues don't matter as much. And people, it's not like a basket of issues or a basket of how the president is performing on those issues. It is so much more about tribal identity and identity politics and things, your views on race, your views on gender issues, your views on urban, rural. that don't necessarily have much to do with how the economy is doing. Now, that said, though, that's not to say that the economy is irrelevant. The cratering economy doomed John McCain in 2008.
Sure.
The cratering economy, along with COVID, doomed Donald Trump. He probably would have won if it hadn't been for COVID and the collapse of the economy in 2020. So it's not like these things don't matter, but all the models, and there's a lot of academic modeling on this, fancy multiple regression models and controlling mathematically for all the different impacts of these different issues. And even after 2016, it was apparent that issues of identity politics, which was mostly race, were now dominant rather than economic issues being dominant, which is a big change.
See, by the way, and this is just for the record, and just so I give you a flavor of the kind of conversations Jeremy and I have. I kind of disagree a little bit about if Trump would have won without COVID. I think he might have. Well, I shouldn't say probably. I think it's a better than even chance he probably still would have lost even without COVID, just because I think people's views on him were sort of made up a long time ago. And if you look at I'm always struck by looking at the head-to-head numbers. There was never a point at which Donald Trump led Joe Biden, never. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that people, I think, just his approval ratings never went up 50% either. They didn't like him. If not for the Electoral College, I don't think he would have had a chance of winning. But it's one of those counterfactuals you can never truly answer.
It's a close call. One of the things I'd say about this, and it gets to the point you were making earlier, and what we were discussing earlier about Donald Trump's approval ratings. They were low, but we saw throughout the Trump presidency in our polls, but really in our focus groups, you could just hear it every time we'd get in a room full of voters. Even Trump voters would say they didn't like him. They'd say, I don't like his tweets. He's rude. He's insulting. But you support him? Yeah. Would you vote for him? Yeah, I'd vote for him. So there was always this gap between his approval rating, which is like, do you like the guy? Like, would you want him to babysit for your kids? On one hand, do you want him to be your president? And I think he would have won because until COVID, you were seeing an awful lot of people who said, yeah, I don't really like the guy, but man, he's a businessman. He really understands the economy and the economy is doing great. And I'd rather have that. And that disappeared once the economy created.
Right. So let me ask you a question about, you came of age in an era of Democratic politics in which Democrats usually lost elections and were badly fractured. And so, if you could look at 93, when Bill Clinton became president in 2009, you had a lot of divisions among Democrats, and that divisions that you could argue, undermined a Democratic president. None of that is happening now. The level of unity in the Democratic Party is rather striking. But even more so, the polling numbers are even more shocking to me, because I don't know there's ever been a Democratic president or any incumbent president or any newly elected president who is as popular among his own party as Joe Biden is. So how much of that do you think is Biden's policies? How much of it is just a question of him not being Trump, or an element of polarization, and that, I'm a Democrat, he's a Democrat, so I'm on his team?
Right. So I think that's right. And I think, one of the reasons that you've long been my favorite columnist and that Truth and Consequences is my favorite newsletter.
Thank you.
Is that, as you've written, what we've seen as part of this process of polarization is sort of a washing out in both parties of centrists. And this is not a new phenomenon. This happens, is a long-term thing. And so the divisions, for example, the old divisions between Northeastern liberal Democrats and Southern conservative Democrats doesn't exist anymore. There aren't any Southern conservative Democrats. Right. And so it really is the case that Democrats are unusually unified. I did come of age when to be a Democrat was always to be a part of a circular firing squad in politics.
Right.
And Democrats are unusually unified, and Republicans, for me, I'm a Democratic pollster and I'm a partisan, they are gloriously divided. It is just a lovely thing to watch. I look at, we're 2 weeks away from the Republican convention for choosing their gubernatorial candidate in Virginia, next door to me, in Maryland. And they have, I think, 7 candidates, and it's an absolute food fight. And the one who's most likely to win, I think, at this point, is this woman named Amanda Chase, who bills herself as Donald Trump, and possibly, no one knows. but a man, Donald Trump in heels,
That's right.
who is so, not only are they divided, but the edge goes right now to the extreme part of the Republican Party. And if she wins, I think she would lose in a landslide, to Terry McAuliffe. The Democrats, by contrast, are completely consolidated. McAuliffe has like 50% in a multi-candidate field. He's like 30, 40 points ahead of anyone. He's got it tied up at this point. And so, and you're seeing that in a lot of places in the US. So Democrats are unified. It's not just at the presidential level, although Biden has helped. I mean, I think Biden, there are a lot of stories now about liberals in the Democratic Party viewing Biden as the boy next door. Like they never really noticed how attractive he was. and now, but you look at what he's done. He got through $2 trillion in spending with the American Rescue Plan. I think he'll get something through on infrastructure. You already have Republicans proposing $600 billion, and he's saying $2.2 trillion. Split the difference, and you're over $1 trillion. So he'll get something through on that. I mean, these are enormous, enormous proposals, and so he's, I think, impressing liberals. He's doing pretty well with a very, very closely divided Congress, and so it's partly about him. And he's. He hasn't made the gaffes that a lot of us thought he might. He tends to run out, or he always did before he was president, to run on at the mouth and make gaffes. He just hasn't done that. He's been very terse and concise and no big gaffes. So I think he's done well, but I think Democrats are also unified, partly because of the sorting out process you've described, and partly because, by comparison, Republicans are so divided. One thing that I keep seeing in the polls that I think is really notable that not a lot of people have commented on is that people hate Congress and people hate politicians. My dearly remembered grandmother, when I informed her I'd gotten into the School of Public Policy, she graduate school, she said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "It's government." She said, "Oh." I said, "Julie, you're not glad I got into graduate school?" She goes, "I grew up believing that there's nothing lower than a politician."
Oh yeah.
And so
right.
And usually the ratings for Democrats in Congress and Republicans in Congress are both like really low and both really similar. Right now, you've seen this in multiple polls. You have double-digit gaps between Democrats in Congress and Republicans in Congress. Latest Quinnipiac poll, early April, 43% approval for Democrats in Congress, 27% for Republicans in Congress. So again, it's not just Trump.
That is a very big gap. Yeah.
Huge. It's not just Trump. It's not just Biden. And it's not just the sorting out process and the unity among Democrats. There's a sense that Democrats have an agenda. They're proposing things. They're getting things done. They're, kicking COVID. And the Republicans just don't seem like they're, other than the word no, they don't seem to have a platform. And I think they're paying a price for it.
So I want to get to that, but I want to just go back to one thing you said a second ago. I think it's interesting. You talked about Virginia, and I think, it's worth mentioning that Terry McAuliffe is an interesting example of the evolution of the Democratic Party, because this is a guy who worked for the Clintons, was their biggest fundraiser. He was known in 2008 during the Democratic primary. He was sort of hated among a lot of Obama supporters because he was, hugely partisan toward Hillary Clinton. He won the governor's race in Virginia and then ended up being one of the most progressive governors Virginia probably has ever had. And he's come almost a darling on the left. And I think it's interesting that McAuliffe, who I don't know where his instincts lie, but certainly struck me as somebody who was more of an establishment, sort of centrist Democrat, has governed as a progressive, because that's kind of where the enthusiasm is in the Democratic Party these days. And so I think someone like McAuliffe in Virginia in particular is a good example of how the ideological center of the Democratic Party has moved leftward. In other words, the ideological, it's a much more progressive party, which I think explains a lot of why Joe Biden is a much more progressive president. And I want to also pick up one thing you said about the gaps with Biden. I think it's a great observation that, I remember writing about Biden in 2019 and just saying, this is a guy who is going to make a mistake, who's going to have a gaffe, who's going to, step on his foot, or shoot himself in the foot, I should say. And I remember seeing him in August in Las Vegas at a couple events he did there. And he was dreadful. I mean, he was really bad. He was meandering. He didn't have, it was just kind of like, he went from one idea to another. He just didn't have any kind of coherent narrative. There was nothing about his candidacy that really you could sort of say, oh, that's what the guy's running for. And then I saw him in December in Iowa for about 5 events over 2 days. And he was like a different candidate. You know, he was coherent. He had a clear narrative. He had a message. He was empathetic as he sort of always is, but he wasn't sort of meandering the way that, you know, he's done through much of his career. And that's the Joe Biden that I'm seeing now. And it is really striking that a guy who's been in politics for 50 years really does seem to have transformed himself in some respects as a politician and become a much more, he was always a good politician, but he's a much more effective politician now than he was even, you know, a couple of years ago. It's extraordinary to see, actually.
I agree with that. And, you know, I remember you calling me after both the Nevada trip and the Iowa trip and commenting on that. You know, one thing I would say is, you know, I'm a pollster, but we also, you know, we work with candidates and campaigns directly, and we coach candidates, and we help them, you know, prepare for their campaigns and perform. And you always go in with the hope that you can take some candidate and give him brilliant advice, and he's going to transform himself and be, you know, the next John Kennedy and things like that. And one thing I've learned the hard way during my career is that, you know, and it's true with candidates, it's true more broadly too, which is, I always tell my team, you know, people once they're 30 years old don't change much. If you can get
thought, Jeremy, just for the record.
Well, I know. think of how that feels for me. That you know, if you can get a candidate to raise his game by 5%, that's real good. That's a good day. That's victory. And I've learned that that's the same, you know, for my employees as well. Now, fortunately, a lot of my employees are under 30, so I watch them grow. But the older employees, you know, it's like it's a fool's errand to think that you're going to take someone who's gotten to 30, 40 and see them change. And it's especially true for top level politicians, because if you think about how they got to where they got, you know, Joe Biden has had a lifetime of mostly winning elections, you know, leave aside his president. He youngest person ever elected to the US Senate, popular, you know, revered. And it's this confirmation bias. They think that what they are doing must be great because they keep winning. And so their incentive psychologically to change radically is low. And so I give Joe Biden a lot of credit because it's harder than we think. And all of you who say, why doesn't, you know, Joe Biden or any other politician, you know, just do this and that and that, think about your own life. How often do you change your own routines by more than 15% in a positive direction? If you're like me, the answer is 0. You know? all my worst habits persist. So I give them a lot of credit because I've just watched politicians, even ones who really are trying to raise their game. It's a lot harder than you think.
Okay, so let's get to the question I think a lot of people are going to be interested in hearing about, which is the Republican Party and what is happening in the Republican Party. And I was struck by, I remember where I read this a day or two ago, some making the point that the GOP is actually worse now than it was under Trump, which didn't seem possible. But it seems as though the extremism in the Republican Party has become more pervasive even than it was under Trump. And I see no indication that Republicans are inclined to cooperate with Democrats on legislative Biden's legislative agenda. So from your perspective, what are you seeing in the numbers in the polling on the GOP? I mean, you mentioned the gap between Democrats in Congress and Republicans in Congress, their favorability, but how do you see what's happening to the party now, and how might that play out, you know, now and into 2022?
Right. So, I mean, I think the Republican Party is in the grips of a process of what economists would call adverse selection. It's also in the medical field, you know, in health policy called a death spiral. Where the people who are most extreme keep winning, and the more the extremists win, the less support the party has in general, the more it loses support among the broad public. But the people who are left supporting are even more extreme. And so then even more extreme candidates keep winning within the party. And it has pushed them so far. And there are some great polling and sort of visual displays of polling by people like the Pew Center, where they'll plot, a polling number, but then they show the Democratic number on one side and the Republican number on the other side, and showing the gap between Democrats and Republicans on that issue. And the gap has just become mind-boggling on issues like COVID, on issues like race, on issues like immigration. It's so much bigger than it ever was in our history. So people, I think the Republican Party is in worse shape now. They're having these internal bloodlettings. The people who are left, like Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, and some of the others who are in Congress on the Republican side, are, I think, just wackadoodles. You have Josh Hawley in the Senate from Missouri voting against a bill, the only senator proudly voting against a bill to make it a crime to do hate crimes against Asian Americans. It's like, why does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I do think they are a party in the grips of a very difficult to break dynamic that inexorably pushes them to the extremes, because that's where the money is, that's where the energy is, that's where the activists are, that's where the social media enthusiasm is, and then I think they get to the general. And if like we were talking about in Virginia, if Amanda Chase wins the gubernatorial nod among the Republicans, I just think that's a very bad dynamic for them. And so, especially as we look toward the midterm elections in 2022, the history is that the party that just won the presidency in the first midterm of a new presidency, loses seats about 95% of the time in the House, about 75% of the time in the Senate, and the average loss in the House is like 26 seats. So,
right.
We've only got a 4-seat, margin right now in the House, and so it's very precarious. And you would think on historical averages, if you were a betting person just based on history, you'd say Democrats are going to lose both the House and the Senate. But I think this dynamic on the Republican side might change that, because they are putting up so many extreme candidates, and their rhetoric is getting so extreme. They're all trooping down to Mar-a-Lago to, tug at the forelock in front of the gold shoes of the master, that I think it makes them look extreme, weak, out of touch with normal Americans. I mean, look, these polls, 70-some% of Americans think this infrastructure is a good idea.
Yeah.
And you have Republicans,
Yeah.
Mitch McConnell called it Orwellian. It's like, if you're an average voter, it's like, what's so Orwellian about not wanting potholes to break my axle on my way to work?
But let me challenge you on this one a second. I agree with you that in a place like Virginia, nominating Amanda Chase, Democrats are likely going to win there anyway, but nominating Amanda Chase means it's going to be like a 70-30. You might see carnage down ballot. But in a place like, for example, I don't know, South Carolina or Ohio, is the opposite true? I mean, does nominating an extreme Republican actually help the Republican Party?
Well, yeah, in red states, in safe red seats or safe red states, all that matters is the primary. And so it does energize the money and the social media and the activists. And there's no real challenge from the Democrats in those places. And so I don't know if it helps them in the long term, but it's a safe strategy, and which is why they keep moving further to the right. I mean, they're not stupid. They are sophisticated politicians, and more seats in the U.S. and more races are safe, either red or blue. And so that all that matters in most places is the primary, not the general election. And so they're playing to that dynamic, but it's creating an overall, it's a prisoner's dilemma, where following your immediate self-interest leads to a long-term negative result. And so, doing the thing to maximize your primary vote is in the aggregate undermining the national image of the party.
So this gets to something that I've been thinking about a lot. You make the point that these politicians are not stupid, and I think this is an important point to make, and one that I think is often forgotten by people who don't, I think, who have maybe have a negative view of Republicans. These guys know what they're doing, right? I mean, they're not. I think you and I had this conversation constantly over the last 4 years, that Republicans who supported Donald Trump, I mean, it was immoral, it was unethical, it was, it was pathetic. It was, they're groveling before this guy who's, functionally capable of being president, but it was smart politically.
Yes.
And it was the best thing for them to do to maintain their jobs. And so I look at somebody like Ron Johnson in Wisconsin, who really, I mean, is an idiot. I mean, let's just be honest about it. He's a moron. And in fact, he gives Tommy Tuberville a run for his money for dumbest U.S. senator, and Marsha Blackburn. And today he said that maybe we're handing out too many vaccines. We should cut back on distribution, because who cares if your neighbor is vaccinated or not? I mean, not a smart guy. He's also, by the way, probably the most vulnerable incumbent in the GOP.
If he runs.
There's 3 Republicans in states that Biden won. One is Pat Toomey, and he's retiring in Pennsylvania. One is Susan Collins, she's won re-election, and there's Johnson. So you would think that Johnson would want to at least, reach out to the center and at least try to win over Democrats. But it seems to me, and I'm not sure he's even running for re-election, but it does seem to me that he, if he is running, has made the calculation, his best bet is to mobilize his base of voters. And that's the only way that he can get reelected in Wisconsin. He cannot win by trying to win over Democrats. And that by trying to win over Democrats, he ends up alienating core Republicans.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that's the wrong move on his part. It might be the best way to get reelected, actually.
Yeah, and it's not just, energizing, mobilizing core Republicans. He and every other Republican is acutely aware that if you anger the Donald will come after you.
That's right.
But that if you flatter tirelessly the Donald, he might come to the state and campaign for you.
Right.
And, Donald Trump, who I am probably the least enthusiastic person in America about Donald Trump. But as a performer, he's good value. He is a canny, entertaining guy, and Republicans like watching him. And if Donald Trump were to come to, again, I don't know if Ron Johnson's going to run, but if he does run, the prospect of having the Donald fly up from Mar-a-Lago to Wisconsin and perform, and that's worth a lot of media attention beyond just
absolutely
energizing your troops. And so I don't think it's dumb politics at all. Now I think it's dumb in the long term, because this guy is sort of a rolling disaster for the Republican Party, but in the short term it makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so I wanted to get to some of the questions, and I have this is a Lester Levine who's on the call here. He asked a good question I think a lot of people are curious about. And maybe, I know it's too early to make predictions, but he's sort of interested in predictions for the House and Senate in 2022 and what you think some of the key issues and factors might be. And I'll just jump to that point. There is some research I've seen recently that suggests that a good economy doesn't necessarily mean a good outcome for the incumbent party in midterms. It doesn't. It's more attuned to presidential approval ratings, which, as we discussed, are in the mid to low 50s and could go higher if the economy improves. So with that in mind, what do you see happening in 2022? And do you think the economy would be enough for Democrats to reverse this tradition of the incumbent party losing in midterm elections?
I think it's really hard. I as a partisan, I like to get overexcited. As you know, I've often gone on sort of binges of optimism that as a Democrat are never rewarded.
Right.
There's a reason these historical averages are so strong. 95% of the time,
right,
the president's party loses a seat, and it has to do with, the attention is on the new president. Expectations are high, and relative to expectations, things tend to disappoint, and there tend to be some missteps, and especially as you think about all the spending. Biden's gotten $2 trillion approved already, probably get another $1 trillion in infrastructure. So he'll be at least at $3, maybe $4 or $5 trillion in new spending. When that happens, there's always scandals. You think about the Solyndra case under Obama, when they were doing these business startup supports clean energy. There's always going to be some misspending. That'll get blown up. So those kinds of things, it's not an accident that happens at the start of a new administration,
right? Because,
you have new programs, they're working the bugs out, there's new money, there are fraudsters out, all the time. And so I think we should just remind ourselves that it's hard to break that historical pattern. In addition, there's some, even though I think Biden's doing really well on the economy and COVID and making some steps on racial justice, there are some issues out there against him that are proving really potent. And the biggest is immigration, or if you want to frame it more broadly, I think the great irritated raw nerve in our body politic right now is race.
Yeah.
I think immigration is mostly, about race, not about really labor force or things like that, which it used to be. It used to be more of a labor issue, but it's about race. And, while Biden has like a 65-20 approval rating on COVID, the numbers are exactly flipped on immigration. You have record numbers of immigrants, especially kids, coming in over the southern border right now. These things take a long time to make them seem well managed. It's a hot button issue for Republicans. They are playing it every day. And so I would love to see Democrats break the historical pattern. And if it happens, it'll be due to a combination of factors. One, that the Democratic president and Congress were responsible for defeating this awful pandemic, which was a historical anomaly in the same way 9/11 was a historical anomaly. And the last president to buck that trend of first midterm losses in the House was George W. Bush right after 9/11.
Right.
So one, it'd be kicking pandemic. Two, it'd be spectacular economic growth. Third, it would be some sense of racial justice, at least heading in the right direction. And fourth, just a sense that Biden was better than people expected. So, and fifth, the dynamics we talked about of the Republicans being in disarray and more extreme and having no real message and saying no to everything. So all those things could happen. But I think if you had to put your money on it, you'd put your money on the Republicans gaining seats in the House and probably enough to take control. I think the Senate's a little different. I mean, the Senate, there's 34 seats up, 20 of them are held by Republicans, 14 held by Democrats. So Republicans are holding more seats. And in particular, 5 of the seats they're holding are open seats, whereas none of the seats that the Democrats are defending are open seats. So there's some, the Senate is always a little bit different and dependent on the map of which seats are up. And so I think, our chances of avoiding a loss of seats in the Senate is probably a little greater. And there's, we've only got, I think, one clearly vulnerable U.S. senator up for re-election, which is Warnock in Georgia. Whereas
Warnock, I would not have picked that one, but that's interesting you said that.
I think him and Maggie Hassan, but I think Maggie Hassan.
I think it's Maggie Hassan personally.
I think Maggie Hassan will be okay. But on the Republican side, as you said, you've got Pat Toomey's seat in Pennsylvania. You've got the Ron Johnson seat in Wisconsin, which he may or may not run for re-election. You've got the possibility of a seat in North Carolina, and maybe even some others. But I think it's a more vulnerable map for the Republicans in the Senate. But I would, if I had to bet, I'd bet sort of. We stay just about where we are in the Senate. Of course, a one vote switch in either direction is seismic, and probably the Republicans take control of the House, which would break my heart. But I think it's more likely than not.
Yeah, it's on the Senate side. I mean, I think what's interesting is that there are no Democrats up in states that Trump won in 2020.
Yeah.
There are 2 Republicans up. There's the Pennsylvania seat and there's Wisconsin seat. So the thing about Georgia, and I'm glad you mentioned Warnock, because somebody did ask this question about, is the Georgia miracle, as this person called it, winning those 2 Senate seats in January, which, by the way, were like epoch-changing elections. My sense of it, and I'm curious how you agree with this. Can Georgia be repeated? To me, the best hope for Georgia for Democrats is that Stacey Abrams runs for governor, which should, I would imagine, mobilize African-American Black voters, which is going to help Warnock. And also, Warnock has raised a ton of money so far. And with the divisions in the Republican Party, I tend to think that's the seat where, with the help of Stacey Abrams and Warnock's fairly large war chest, that's the seat that looks safer to me than, for example, New Hampshire, where you've got Governor Sununu, who's going to challenge Maggie Hassan, and who was pretty popular because of his handling of COVID. So, but on the Georgia question, because this was raised earlier, can this be repeated? What happened in Georgia and elsewhere?
So Lester Levine did a note in the chat, which is a great point, which is the one thing I didn't talk about, which is an enormous factor here, is voter suppression, which takes many forms. And he mentioned gerrymandering and drawing district lines, which is going to happen because we've just had the decennial census, but also the kind of voter suppression laws that are now, there are over 250 laws in state legislatures across the country aimed at suppressing basically democratic votes in the name of, vote protection and anti-fraud,
right?
Which is a canard. So I think that's a big variable. And I think in Georgia, one of the things we don't know, everyone's, there's been a lot of attention to this new law on restricting voting.
Right.
And that you can't bring a bottle of water to someone standing in line waiting to vote. And that's clearly targeted at suppressing the Democratic and especially the African-American vote. But you can imagine that it might backfire. You can imagine it's like, what we all heard when we were growing up and your parents say, don't make me come down there, right? You can imagine Democrats just getting pissed off about it and really like that it becomes a galvanizing tool for organizers in the Black community and statewide among Democrats, that they really, bear down on how to organize within the four corners of these new rules in ways that energize, Democratic voters, especially African Americans, especially around the Atlanta suburban area, which was the key in the presidential contest, that it could, really energize them. And, the other variable that we haven't discussed for 2022 is Donald Trump. He's not on the ballot. He wasn't on the ballot in the Georgia race. We don't know what impact that's going to have. I think it has an impact. I think if he's not at play, on some hand, to some extent, you lose Democratic turnout and enthusiasm because they don't get the chance to vote against Donald Trump. But I think you lose probably slightly more Republican enthusiasm for him. Republicans
the biggest question going forward in American politics. Who gets hurt more by Trump not being a candidate? Right?
I think Republicans. I mean, I
kind of agree with you.
I think Donald. I think the Republicans, again, have been in this sort of death spiral, pursuing policies that are not broadly popular, that appeal to their richest and most nativist and racist elements of their party, and that they were only able to continue winning to the extent they could either suppress the vote through gerrymandering and, or suppress democracy, Supreme Court, things like that, or have a sort of aberrant popular entertainer as their figurehead. And I think his departure, may lead people to focus more on sort of what they're voting for on policy rather than the man they're voting for. And I think on balance, it probably hurts them.
So that leads to a good question. Somebody asked, Vincent Simonelli asked this question: does Josh Hawley really compete among Republicans? And I want to talk to you about the 2024. I know it's very early, but you and I had this conversation, and I may write about this soon, about a week or two ago, in which we kind of came to, and this is going to sound a little bit harsh, but we came to this conclusion that the biggest problem that Republicans have 2024 is none of their candidates who are running for president are mentally unwell. And we said this, and we meant by this was, and this is a serious point, and so hear me out here. The meant by this was that, one of the things that people liked about Trump, Republicans liked about Trump, was that he would say anything. He didn't abide by any kind of, social norm at all. I always think back, and this is a sort of a random example, but for example, after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, he publicly mocked Christine Blasey Ford. I mean, every Republican out there kind of, said, try to be respectful toward her, but at the same time, said we still want to vote for Kavanaugh. He actually attacked her, which is just, disgusting. But it's the kind of thing that Trump would do because he doesn't understand why that's wrong. And I think people like Hawley or Cruz, they're so calculating that they would never do that because they would think that that's not going to work. It's going to be inappropriate. But someone like Trump, who doesn't, who really is just unwell, goes ahead and does it. And so the way that I look at it is that, you don't have a candidate who's going to just appeal to that Republican kind of, fever swamp the way that Trump does. And that's the biggest problem they have going into 2024. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, Republicans have no monopoly on mental illness among politicians. Having spent my whole life working for politicians, I got to tell you, I mean, I love politicians. I think what they do is enormously important, very difficult.
Right.
But they're all sociopaths.
They're all,
calculating people who think the rules of society don't apply to them. So just a note on that.
Not Joe Biden, though. I think he's interesting. He's not a sociopath, I would say.
Well, maybe him and Walter Mondale.
Walter Mondale.
Sure. But I would actually say it goes the other way, which is I think Cruz and Hawley and some of these Republicans think they have seen the light. They think they have seen the path, which is you just got to be crazy. And the crazier stuff you say and the bigger stunts you pull and the more racist and misogynistic and nativistic and offensive you are, the better you'll do in this party. And there's some evidence for that. And so you didn't see Josh Hawley being temperate and urging restraint on January 6th when the protesters were storming the Capitol. He gave them a raised fist salute. I mean, yeah, you might say he was being moderate because it wasn't a Hitler salute, but it was pretty brazen. And I think they are all doing this. And so you see it with Amanda Chase and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all these people. They think that's the formula. And so I wouldn't bet on the rest of the Republican Party moderating their behavior because they're so mentally balanced. I think they will try to imitate Trump. Now, I don't think they'll get away with it because I think he is sort of a one-off. But I think they will try. I don't know who's going to win the
I think they're going to try also, but I think they won't be as successful because like with Ted Cruz, for example, I mean, I remember seeing him a lot in the 2016 campaign on the trail. He's just a very phony guy. He's very unctuous. Like you hard to take him seriously. You can tell that he's saying what people want to hear. And with Trump, you don't get that impression at all. So,
I mean, a huge thing in politics is authenticity.
Exactly.
And Trump is authentically crazy.
Yes, that's right. So Ian Zimmerman asked a really good question, and this relates to what you just talked about January 6th. What's the long-term, or short-term and the long-term, impact on the GOP of January 6th?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so many things happened in the last 4 years, and you and I, we could run a video montage of all the calls we've had where we said to each other, this is it. This is going to change things.
Exactly.
Mueller and Russia, and then Ukraine and the Zelensky call, and then January 6th. And every time, it turned out Trump was pretty smart. He could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and still win.
Yeah.
And so nothing, and it goes back to your point about just hardening and deepening partisan divisions, that they determine everything. And you can, nothing else really has much impact. So I think January 6th, unfortunately, is not having much of an impact. I think, it's a little like COVID. On balance, it certainly wasn't good news for Trump and the Republicans.
Sure.
And Trump's ratings are, since January 6th, have been low, lower than they were. They're in the high 30s rather than the low 40s. And so I think there was a little bit of a price. It's not nearly the price they should have paid. So and I think that issue will recede into memory. I mean, we're in a cycle now where huge things happen and 3 weeks later, something else huge happens and we can't even remember 3 weeks earlier.
It's actually funny you mentioned this because today is the Bleach anniversary. It was a year ago today that Trump, and I meant to rant about this on Twitter because Politico had this piece looking back at the bleach comment. I'm referring to Donald Trump saying a year ago that people should be injected with bleach or direct sunlight in order to kill COVID. And this Politico piece was basically arguing that this was like a seminal moment in Trump's presidency. It convinced Americans that he couldn't, his COVID response was terrible. And I kind of was like, that's bullshit. That's not what happened. Like it didn't matter at all. And it was funny because they only quoted, a bunch of Trump staffers and Biden staffers. And of course they thought that they're obsessed with the campaign. Most Americans probably weren't even aware of it. Or if they were, their view on it was almost certainly guided by how they felt about Trump at that point, whether they liked him or hated him. So if they liked him, they probably were just kind of like, all right, they'll find some way to excuse it. If they don't like him, then they'll say he's terrible. So I don't know that it meant all that much. And I don't know that any of these events mean all that much. I hate to say it. I want to just let one person kind of, if
Please.
anybody wants to ask a question directly, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can get to ask a question if anybody wants to jump in here. I'll just see one raised hand, or if somebody wants to unmute and just ask a question, go ahead and feel free. Okay, no, all right. Well, then I'll just stick to a question Gabriel Miller asked. I think it's a really good one.
Great question.
It seems he's saying it's hard to get Democrats to turn out during non-presidential years. Is that true? Is it not true? And is that going to be different, do you think, in 2022?
So it's a great question. It was historically true. And, I came of age believing that it was an iron law, because the people who are our voters are disproportionately people of color who vote at lower rates, especially on midterms. They were lower income people who vote at lower rates in midterms. And they were younger people who vote at lower rates in midterms. 2018 was a huge historical moment because it broke all those rules. Turnout of African Americans was at historic highs, and young people voted in huge numbers. And it's why, it's why we retook the House by a huge, huge blue wave. And so I think we're, at a moment where, if you look at the long-term historical trends, you would think that there's going to be a big fall off in Democratic voting in the 2022 midterm. But 2018 is a big cautionary that might not happen. Now, maybe it was just, and for sure it was partly this huge reaction to Trump, but there may still be a feeling in 2022, and this is one of the unknowns, that Democrats in a sense are still running against Trump, or they're still running against the party of Trump, or the Trump lights who are dominating the Republican Party. So I think, it's certainly true that that's been the historical pattern, but 2018 broke it, and it's a little indeterminate right now. It's one of the big questions we're facing.
I mean, I think if you also, this may be an issue too, that if you go back and look at, for example, 1994 and 2010, which were both very bad years for Democrats, the economy was in pretty bad shape both of those years. And I think, I've written this before, but I just think that the chances that we're going to see by 2022 a rather strong economic growth and, being past the pandemic, it's a real good possibility. It also seems to me, as far as Democratic turnout, that you've got a situation in which Democrats are getting what they want from this president, to a degree that I don't think many of us even expected. And I do wonder how that affects turnout as well. I mean, I agree with you, what you said earlier, that we sort of reached a post kind of policy or post policy outcome point in American politics. We're all about tribe. But if you're a Democrat and you want to know, and you want to decide whether I'm going to go out and vote in 2022, the fact that the president, who's a Democrat, is doing what you voted for him to do, I think that has to have some, at least on the margins, has to have some impact on voter enthusiasm among Democrats.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's also Lester Levine's points about, the gerrymandering districts, but also, HR1, S1, this big omnibus voting reform bill that Democrats in the House and Senate have put through, which would try to sort of block Republicans at the state level from all these voter suppression laws. If that passes, it's going to require overcoming the filibuster. But if that somehow passes, that might make it much easier for a lot of Democratic voters to vote, and that'll be a factor as well.
But just on this final question, are you generally of the view that these voter suppression tactics do not have a huge impact on elections? Along the margins, they do, but that they don't decide elections necessarily?
Well, yes and no. I mean, they do have an impact, and in a close election, they can make the difference.
Right, in a close election. Right, in a close election.
That's what we've gotten. You look at how little, the small margins by which Stacey Abrams lost, and so, and then Joe Biden won. And the difference, arguably, is that we were in a pandemic and there was universal mail-in balloting,
right,
and it was very easy for people to vote. And if you can institutionalize that, that could make enough of a difference that, you really see Democratic voters turning out in higher numbers than they used to in midterms.
Right. Well, listen, I know you gotta go at 1 o'clock, so I'm gonna finish up here, but I want to just take a second to thank Jeremy. That was just a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Really glad you took the time to sit down with everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Those of you who are on the call and those of you who are listening after the fact. I'm going to try to do these as often as possible. I think they're a lot of fun, and I love the questions and input I'm getting from readers, because there really were some smart insightful questions today. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and I'll have a great weekend. And thank you, Jeremy. And
thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone for the great conversation.
Thanks again. All righty. Bye-bye.